Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I'm your host, Rupa Subramanya. Today, we have an amazing show for you. We're going to be speaking to a remarkable and courageous person whose life story navigates the intricate intersection of faith, culture, and human rights advocacy. I'm thrilled to have Yasmine Mohammed on the show. She is a Canadian with Palestinian and Egyptian roots. She's a dedicated human rights campaigner. She stands as a fierce advocate for the rights of women and oppressed minorities in Muslim majority countries, and more generally is seen as a stern critic of religious fundamentalism all over the world. She's also author of an important book which I urge you all to read. It's called Unveiled: How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam. And she's also president of the nonprofit organization Free Hearts, Free Minds. I do think that her book Unveiled is especially relevant in the context of the current ongoing crisis between Israel and Hamas. And in her book, she offers a very important perspective of her own life. She was born in the West, but raised in a religious fundamentalist Islamic home. And her experiences paint a vivid picture of straddling these two worlds and how she found herself one day eventually becoming an advocate for the rights of women and oppressed minorities, people oppressed by fundamentalist Islam. She was raised as a Muslim, but Yasmine no longer identifies herself as being a Muslim. She has left Islam. She considers herself to be an ex-Muslim. And in fact, her name, Yasmine Mohammed itself, is a pseudonym to protect her identity, given all of the threats she's received over the years for being a critic of Islam. Yasmine Mohammed has also been a very important voice, in my opinion, in the highly polarized debate over the continuing war between Israel and Hamas. She's been writing some incredibly moving pieces recently about the crisis and her own personal connection to Gaza. So please welcome Yasmine to the show. I just wanted to again reiterate just how big a fan I am of yours, and again, I want to say that I was so excited to discover you're Canadian, and then you're like sharing my stuff, and I'm like, wow, I'm in seventh heaven. And then so this is a real honor for me to be speaking to you. And so welcome to my show, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I want to start, Yasmine, by asking you about your journey. You were raised in a super strict Islamic household. You eventually renounced Islam. Could you share us? I know you've talked about this many times, but for the purpose of this show, could you share with us your journey? What was involved in breaking free from the constraints of an intensely religious environment in the context of the religious household you were growing up in?
So to be honest, when I was growing up, I didn't think that it was intensely religious. I didn't feel like, we were extremists or super, fundamentalists by any means. It was the same as everybody in my community, everybody that I knew at the mosque, everybody that I went to Islamic school with. And now that I'm an ex-Muslim, it's so similar to the stories that I'm hearing from people. I've got a podcast as well called Forgotten Feminists, where I speak to women who, mostly the podcast is women who have renounced Islam. And we finish each other's sentences. Like it was really not as extremist as as it's now popular to say. The truth is the mainstream Muslims were more like me, and the rare ones are the open-minded, freedom-loving Muslims who renounce Hamas, who renounce, the anti-Semitism and the homophobia and the violence and all these other aspects of the religion. They are the ones that are the rare gems. So yeah, the way I grew up, I think was pretty typical. even though I was in Vancouver, Canada, it was not typical to my peers in Canada, but it was pretty typical to Muslim upbringing. When my mom was divorced from my dad, she was just her and 3 kids in Canada on her own. And so she went to the mosque looking for support, looking for comfort, looking for friendship. And that's where she found a man who was already married, already had 3 children, but he took my mom on as his second wife. So technically that's illegal in Canada, but it happens all the time. The first wife was his legal wife, and my mom was his Islamic wife. And his first wife and set of kids lived upstairs, and we lived downstairs. And, my sister and I were put in hijab. We went to Islamic schools. Everything became haram when he entered our life. It was like I could no longer play with my non-Muslim friends. I could no longer celebrate birthdays. I could no longer go swimming, ride my bike, listen to music. Everything was forbidden. So my mom started to become, him and my mom together started to become a lot more Islamist. So a lot of political, as opposed to just the religion, the faith, the belief system, there's also part of the religion is this idea of a caliphate, and that Islam needs to dominate the planet, that everybody needs to be Muslims. So that's more of a political ideology that's referred to as Islamist, and that started, well, the most popular is the Muslim Brotherhood. So after the Turkish Ottoman fell, the Muslims got together and they're like, okay, what do we do now? How are we going to spread Islam? We can't do it like the sword and raping and pillaging the way we did the first time. So let's try and come up with another strategy. And they came up with the strategy that they've been using for the past 100 or so years, which is, it's a multi-pronged approach, one of them being immigration, another one being through the wombs of the Muslim mothers. So basically through marry multiple women and get each one pregnant multiple times. And then you have a lot of Muslims in that area, and then you can have political power. And the third one is using secular laws against itself, which is one that we see happening quite often in Canada. So my mom and the man that she married kind of got swept up in this Islamist boom, which was really indicative of what was happening all across the Middle East and North Africa and the Muslim world, starting with, the Islamic regime in Iran was the big boom, and then it just spread. And so, and it spread everywhere. So the mosque, we used to have this little mosque that was run by an imam from India, and he was very like love thy neighbor kind of imam. And then when the Saudi money came in, suddenly he was replaced with an imam from Egypt, and his wife was wearing niqab, like head to toe in black. We'd never seen that before. The kids are running around going, there's a penguin, there's a ninja, like at the Islamic school. We're like, what the heck is this? But everybody got swept up in it. Suddenly you saw everybody was wearing niqab. It was more popular than hijab even. Yeah, so that was the whole trajectory up until 9/11, basically. For me, that was the big boom for me. When 9/11 happened, I had already, I'm skipping over, there's so much, Rupa, but basically.
Oh, no, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, in terms of time frame, when was this? When, your parents, your mother and your stepdad, you saw them getting increasingly radicalized. You were in an Islamic school. I'm wondering, was this before 9/11?
Oh, yes, that was in the 80s and 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I'm assuming that 9/11 had the effect of making people who are already radicalized, if it's even possible to get them more radicalized.
Oh yeah, super empowered, super excited, super happy, super
Mm,
feeling very powerful, very similar to how they're feeling right now.
mm,
Um, yeah, it was that was part of the reason, part of the difficulty that I had with calling myself a Muslim at that time was because if you can, you know, even as a Canadian, when 9/11 happened, we all felt affected. Like we were all impacted through this, ripple effect.
mm.
And to see my family, friends, community, everybody around me celebrating, joyful, excited over the deaths of all of these innocent people.
Yeah.
It was just too much. It was emotionally really, really difficult for me to reconcile how I can be a part of a community that can be so jubilant over the deaths of
Yeah.
innocent people.
At what point did you decide to break free?
So when 9/11 happened, I was in a university at that point. I had broken free. So my mom had forced me into a marriage, and the man she married, I don't like to refer to him as anything else.
Yeah.
Um, they had forced me into a marriage with a man who my mom chose because she said he's strong enough to control you. So they chose a terrorist. He was an Al-Qaeda terrorist, and he had been in Afghanistan with bin Laden for, over a decade before coming to Canada. And once I married him, of course, head to toe in black, my life was completely shut down, separated from everybody. It's as horrible as you could possibly imagine when I say I was married to a terrorist. But I had a daughter with him. And when I had my daughter, I knew that I didn't want her to live the same life that I had lived, and I knew I had to get out. And so I was able to get away from him, was able to get away from my mom. Very difficult, convoluted, complicated process, but I'll just skip past it all. Eventually, I was able to get away from them all and start going to university, which I never imagined I would ever be able to do. And in university, I was taking a history of religions course. And that was the first time in my life that I was able to critically examine Islam. I was actually able to ask questions, which was completely forbidden before that. Questions were like, if you're asking questions, that means the devil is whispering these things in your ear, So I'm taking this course where I'm allowed to critically examine the religion for the first time. And also 9/11 happened at the same time. So really, I was just like, from both intellectually and emotionally, I was just bombarded. And by the end of that year, I knew I didn't want to be a Muslim anymore. But I didn't have the courage to come out publicly. And by that, I mean, like, I still called myself a Muslim. I just said, oh, I'm not really practicing, or I'm not very religious, and things like that. And it took a while before I started, taking off my hijab and being publicly looking outwardly as how I felt inside. It's a slow, difficult process for many reasons, and one of them being you can be executed for the crime of renouncing Islam. So yeah, and also my daughter,
Yeah.
her dad is a terrorist, and he with a very big organization, and I didn't know where his friends were and if they would find us if he sent them after us. And so I stayed quiet for a very long time.
So how old were you, or in what year was this when you were in university and you took this course at university, and you had this moment of realization just how incredibly.
I must have been, yeah, it
Yeah.
was 20. I was in my 20s. I was in my mid 20s. So it was kind of like a process, I
Yeah.
would say probably by the time, um, Yeah, and probably not before I was 30, maybe 29, 30 was when I was finally able to say, I'm not a Muslim anymore.
Well, so I wanted to ask you about that. A lot of Muslims will, that I've debated with, and I'll just briefly tell you, I partly grew up in Dubai at a time when it was not as liberal. I even put that in quotes because I don't think they're truly liberal. At a time when it was, again, you can't question Islam there, and it's very similar to your experience in the sense that asking questions would be like the devil is making you do this. And when I came to Canada, I experienced this incredible freedom where I could express my thought, I could criticize anything, and I really grew intellectually as a person when I came to Canada. A lot of Muslims that I debate with, devout Muslims, will say, no, that is not representative of mainstream Islamic view. What people are doing, that's not Islam. Islam is religion of peace. It's a peaceful religion. We don't intend or we don't mean any harm to anybody. And so this is all like misinformation or a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of what Islam really stands for. And so we are devout Muslims, and they haven't left the faith. You decided that you just didn't want to be part of Islam anymore because you don't think, because for you, Islam does represent those things.
Yeah, because it's not I wish that I could be living in a la la land, and say this has nothing to do with Islam and that's not real Islam. But the truth is, my mother was the head of the Islamic Studies department at the Islamic school. She's an Al-Azhar scholar. She had a master's degree in Islamic Studies from Al-Azhar. And we had to learn the religion very, very well in order, to not embarrass her, to not bring shame upon her in the Islamic school. So all of us had to be very versed and knowledgeable in the religion. So for every person that tells you that's not part of Islam, I can point exactly to the hadith or to the ayah in the Quran that specifically talks about exactly what is happening. So, 80% of Muslims don't even speak Arabic. They can read it as if you're reading, any other language that you just can't understand. You can phonetically read it. They can phonetically read the Quran, but they don't understand what it is saying. And on top of that, most Muslims don't even bother reading the Quran. One book, they couldn't even be bothered to read it, let alone all of the ahadith. So they just take whatever their imam tells them. And if it's a nice imam, like the one that we had from India before the Egyptian one came in, then sure, you can go your whole life thinking that this is a religion of peace and everything's lovely and there's no problems. But if you go into the actual books yourself, if you do your own research and your own reading, you'll find that the imam has been protecting you from all of that. The imam has chosen to pick and choose the good verses and to share those with you. And, good on him for doing that. That's great. There's a lot of imams out there that do that, but we can't pretend that that has nothing to do with the religion. And if you just look at the, let's say, for example, when they say, oh, homophobia has nothing to do with Islam, killing the LGBT has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, well then, can you explain to me why 15 Muslim majority countries that are, their religions were, their laws were created by Sharia scholars, PhDs in Islamic studies and in Islamic law, and those countries have decided to execute gay people? So, you know what I mean? Like, so if you're just some dude that is in Toronto and you think that you want to be a Muslim and gay at the same time, that's cool. That's fine. You have every right to do that. But you can't pretend that your religion does not call for your execution. It absolutely does. But you can choose to renounce that or ignore that or pretend it doesn't exist and then go on living your life. But it is an outright lie to say that the sources for all of the violence that we're seeing, the anti-Semitism that we're seeing, the anti-woman bigotry that we're seeing, the all of this supremacist narcissism that we're seeing, all of that, all of it has a straight root back into the doctrine. And what's important to note here is the doctrine in Islam is different from other religions in that it is considered the literal word of Allah. There's no metaphors, there's no interpreting, there's no, it's just a story. No, it's specific edicts. Do this, don't do that. And so when it goes back to the Quran and when you see it written there, and if it says, whatever it is that it says, then that's what it is. It's the word of Allah. If it says beat your wife, it means beat your wife.
Amazing. And we've come to a point here in Canada that even questioning the doctrine of Islam is seen as Islamophobic. Anything that criticizes Islamic practices is seen as Islamophobic, and you're censured. You could be censured as a result of that. So basically, you're saying that there's no such thing as a secular Muslim. That concept cannot exist.
Oh, no. I definitely believe that there are secular Muslims out there. There's no such thing as a secular Islam.
Okay.
Yeah. So if there's a secular Muslim out there that, and there are lots of them, they are choosing to ignore, they're cherry picking their religion. And that's, I have no problem with that. I think that's great. I would rather be neighbors with a Muslim who is not following their religion literally versus a Muslim who has chosen to follow it literally. But even those secular Muslims, they don't know, or they are lying when they say that Islam itself is very anti-secular, incredibly anti-freedom of religion. They'll execute you. That's the freedom you get. Yeah.
Do secular Muslims, even if they're selectively, or maybe they're the selective amnesia when it comes to what the Quran, the Hadiths actually say, you think, in a sense, do they present a path towards reforming Islam? Because Islam hasn't, to my knowledge, has not gone the kind of reformation that we've seen in Christianity, for example, or even my religion, Hinduism, which has gone through various waves of reform, but Islam hasn't. When a secular Muslim goes up against someone who is like a mullah, who really truly believes in what or an imam who truly believes in what the Quran is saying, literally taking it at face value, do you see that as a way that the religion could be reformed? Because it's kind of fostering some kind of a debate, if you will.
Yeah. The truth is, secular Muslims their lives are in just as much danger as mine is, or any other person who has outwardly and outrightly renounced the religion. They are hated in the Muslim community. They are considered not Muslims, So, let's take some examples. Like, for example, in Pakistan, there's an Ahmadi community of Muslims that are just different. They have different beliefs, but they still want to consider themselves Muslims. Or Shia in Afghanistan. What happens to the Shia in Afghanistan? They're killed. What happens to the Ahmadi in Pakistan? They're killed. These are other Muslims. But because they believe in a slightly different flavor of Islam, they're killed. They're persecuted or executed. So when you talk about secular Muslims, or even people like me who are ex-Muslims, they see us as all the same. Unless you are following exactly the way that they want you to follow it, then you are, at risk of being murdered.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about the hijab, Yasmine. I have been openly critical of the hijab, especially when it comes to kids wearing them. I think if you're an adult, my own view is when it comes to a range of different things, you're free to do what you want, as long as you're not breaking the law. But for kids, I've seen with my own eyes in places like in India, I've seen 6-7-year-old girls being forced to wear the hijab. And I've asked the parents, why are you doing this? And they've said, well, we need to protect her modesty. And I said, why? She's only 6 years old. Why are you basically sexualizing this poor child at that very young age? And the reaction I get when I say this kind of thing here in Canada is that I'm accused of being an Islamophobe. And people are not able to understand that it is inherently problematic to impose the hijab on a child. What does the Quran say? What is your own view on the hijab? Women in Iran are dying, basically dying in the streets of Iran to get the hijab off their heads, and here we're seeing it as a symbol of women's empowerment. How do you explain that?
Absolutely. So women in Iran are obviously superhuman, amazing, standing in front of the IRGC, burning their hijabs. They're at a completely different level of bravery. But there are feminists all across the Muslim majority world doing the same thing. Maybe not as outwardly and as, courageously, but they're doing it. Feminists exist everywhere that are pushing against this hijab and that are pushing for a woman's freedom to choose to take it off, because they like to tell you that it's a choice, but your only choice is to put it on, but you don't get to choose to take it off. Once you choose to take it off, whether you're in Algeria or in Egypt or in Iraq or in Pakistan, you will either be, the society will look down on you as like a filthy, dirty whore on one end of the scale. And at the other end of the scale, you could be honor killed by your family because they're so, horrified that you would dishonor the family by showing, hair. So, and then you talk about the West, this is the embarrassing part, because in the Muslim world, we have, like, if you look at my hashtag free from hijab or the no hijab day hashtag, it's going to be full of women. In Saudi Arabia, they're taking their niqabs off and stepping on them. They're burning their hijabs all over the world. Women are ripping them off all over the world. But in the West, that's where they believe that the hijab is an empowering symbol. Nobody believes that in the Muslim world. Everybody understands, all the feminist women all over Middle East and North Africa understand that this is an anti-woman tool of misogyny. It perpetuates rape culture. It encourages victim blaming. It's a gender segregating piece of clothing. And we risk our lives to remove it. People are thrown in prison over it. I don't know how you can pretend that anything with that long list of crimes around it can be empowering. But in the West, they have somehow just slurped up the Islamist propaganda. This word Islamophobia was created in Iran. It was created by the Islamic Republic of Iran to delude these useful idiots in the West into making them think. I mean, the truth needs to be said, Rupa, at the end of the day, like, to get them to bleat like sheep, Islamophobia, 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 whenever they see anybody criticizing this religion. And it absolutely needs to be criticized. And it is criticized. You're talking about you don't like to see children in niqab. Either do I. And in Egypt and in Morocco and in so many Muslim majority countries, they don't want to see their children, their little girls in hijab in the schools either. And in fact, in a lot of those countries, they have banned the niqab as well. But when it happens in those countries, we don't hear about it, even though it should be something to be celebrated. But instead, when France, for example, says we don't want children to be wearing hijab in public schools, everybody is up in arms. You have all of the Western left, screaming like, no, let the children be oppressed. Sexualize the children in France. Like, what are you celebrating right now? What are you encouraging right now? But the reason why they're such useful idiots is because they don't know anything. They don't understand the context. They don't understand it. Islam is the second largest religion on the planet. It's an absolute shame that people are so ignorant about it. But it's that ignorance that allows them to be duped so easily. And this is why you'll find them in the streets with their supporting Hamas, right? Because they're like, oh, they're freedom fighters. They're revolutionaries. They don't understand. They don't know anything about what's going. They couldn't find Palestine. Try to get them to find Gaza on a map. There's no way. They're chanting from the river to the sea. They don't know what river and they don't know what sea. They don't know what they're doing. They're just making it so noisy and making it so difficult for reformed Muslims' voices or progressive thinking Muslims to get their voices out, because they're being drowned out by these morons. And the reason why these morons all have microphones is because of Islamist funding coming from Qatar, coming from Iran. They're paying billions of dollars into Ivy League American universities to push their propaganda, and it's successful. And then they go and they make their little TikTok videos and whatever, and it's like this cancer. It just spreads, and before you know it, people are just repeating these little memes of topics that are actually huge and complicated, but they don't even know the first thing about it. All they know is to just repeat whatever little meme they saw on their 7-second clip.
Yeah, it's all quite dispiriting. I mean, I've personally experienced this with some people who should know better. It's you're just pulling your hair out because, and I've actually have lived experience, to borrow a phrase from, a term from the left, of actually having been forced into these things, and, and I rebelled. And I'm not a Muslim, but I lived in an Islamic country, so I know this quite well. But all of this leads to, nicely leads to my next question for you, Yasmine, and that is the current conflict, the Israel-Palestinian conflict that is currently underway right now. I've been reading some of what you've written recently I've been moved by some of what you've written. Your father was from Gaza, and you wrote this moving piece in Tablet magazine called Gaza, My Lost Home. And you say you're mourning for both Israeli and Palestinian lives. And you also say that Hamas has ensured that there will be no more Palestine and no more hope for an independent state. Could you tell us what you mean by this?
Well, when I wrote that article, it was like the day after October 7th. So, I was feeling incredibly depressed, demoralized, and terrified for what the future was going to hold, because there's no doubt that when you send terrorists into a country to murder people in their homes or murder people at a music festival, there's absolutely no doubt that the country is going to retaliate, and it's going to be bloody. It's going to be bad. It's going to be ugly. Everybody could see that happening, and so I knew that a lot of Palestinian lives were going to be lost now because of what Hamas had done. I don't care, to be perfectly honest, if Hamas lives are lost. Let them, I hope they're all lost. But the truth is that they hide amongst innocent Palestinians. They hide in the homes of the Gazan people, in the neighborhoods of innocent people. And as much as we would love to be able to say that that Israel would like to, only kill Hamas terrorists and not hurt any civilians or not hurt any innocent people, that's simply not possible in war, and it's simply not possible when you're dropping bombs. War is really ugly, and a lot of people now are playing sort of this game where they can say, as if it's like a video game where you can go in there and pinpoint specifically who it is that you want to kill. It doesn't work that way. Israel called people literally in their homes, telephoned each family and said, get out, because there are Hamas terrorists in your neighborhood and we are going to bomb it. So they did as much as they could to try and save as many civilian lives. But, you know, like, let's take a look at what America did after Pearl Harbor, right? They dropped nuclear bombs on, you know, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. How many innocent lives were lost because of the few American lives that were lost as well? You know what I mean? Like this idea now that people talk about proportionality and war and something like that, you know, that's not, you know, when you have people coming into a country and murdering families in their homes, you have to expect 100% that country is going to retaliate. That's just a statement. But let's continue with that thought for a moment too, and realize that Israel is one of the strongest militaries on the planet. You know, so you're playing with a very big fire right now when you start doing stupid things like that, horrific things like that. And not only that, but the Jewish people have a history which is not even that far back in history. The Holocaust was not that long ago. It's still fresh in all of our memories. And they are, you know, 0.2% of the planet are Jewish people. So when you kill 1,400 people in a day, plus kidnap over 200, Jewish people are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for the survival of the Jewish tribe at this point. And so as much as I am sad and horrified by what is happening in Gaza right now, I put the blame squarely in Hamas's hands, because Israel has reacted in a much even more calmer way than any other country would have even reacted to this, to something like that happening to them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, Israel is often caught between a rock and a hard place and held to an impossible standard. It's surrounded by countries that do not wish its existence. Would you know, these are very hostile countries. Even if they made peace with Israel, they're still very fundamentally quite hostile. I think it's possible to feel empathy, as you have written about, empathy for the people of Gaza, innocent Gazan civilians, the children and the elderly, who have been caught in this, you know, who've been caught up in this conflict. They're suffering. The Israeli civilians have suffered. They're also suffering. They continue to suffer from the barrage of Hamas rockets that continue to hit Tel Aviv, and thank God for the Iron Dome. And I think it's possible to feel empathy for Gazan civilians without saying that they're all Hamas supporters. And that was going to be my next question to you, which is something you point out. I think it's a very important point that is missing in much of the discourse I feel here in Canada. That, you know, you said that many people wrongly conflate Hamas and all Palestinians, and that some people have just assume now that if you're advocating for the Palestinian cause, and let's remind ourselves that the Palestinian cause has been a cause that has predated this current crisis. It's been there. Well, why are we talking about a two-state solution if there is no Palestinian cause, right? So these people are supporters of Hamas. I'm sure there are many supporters of Hamas at these protests. And but how do you think that this conflation has come about that's something that I'm trying to figure out in the context of this current crisis. 2 years ago, I'd see these marches on my street in Ottawa, from the river to the sea. Nobody paid any attention to it. No one called them Hamas supporters, although I'm sure they were, but now they're seen as Hamas supporters. What do you think is going on?
Well, I mean, these rallies started immediately after October 7th. Like October 8th, they were in the streets talking about revolution, talking about freedom fighters, talking about like our glory to our martyrs, Like there was no question. So the any marches that would have happened prior to this could have potentially been people who truly were interested in, you know, in the Palestinian cause. But after October 7th, those people have been, you know, it almost, I don't want to say hijacked, but they have been, you know, there has been an interjection of many people who also support Hamas, like celebrate Hamas. And so that's the difference. Now, we talked before about how my dad was from Gaza, and one of the things that my dad spent a lot of time in his activism speaking up against Hamas, he was disgusted and angry that when people think of the Palestinian cause, they think of Hamas. He's like, you know how horrifying that is? You know how embarrassing it is that people equate your homeland to terrorists? You know, he was so repulsed at that. But what's he gonna do? You know, what's any freedom-loving, peace-loving Gazan gonna do? Their voices are not heard. In Gaza, when they tried to have they had protests. They had a protest called "We Want to Live," and that was a protest against the Hamas quote unquote government. And people were just like, they disappeared, they were beaten up in the streets, they were arrested. There are videos online of this one man who was being dragged behind a motorcycle, like his body is just being dragged. There's all sorts of stories. There's a very important organization called Whispered from Gaza, where they ask people from Gaza to tell us exactly how they're feeling and what they're thinking. And they share those audio clips, and then they add like animation to it. And in those audio clips, you can hear people from Gaza telling you about how when the Hamas leadership came in, there was basically a civil war where they murdered the Fatah supporters, who was the more the non-terrorist
although
leaders.
they were terrorists at one point.
They were, yes. I mean, potato. I guess it's all
history is
it's a spectrum of terrorists.
Exactly. History is complicated. There's no question about it. I mean, I do have to remind people that the PLO, Yasser Arafat, was a terrorist at one point.
Exactly.
And then
exactly.
Then
no
he
doubt.
Was, normalized, and he wanted to make peace, and all of that is good. I think eventually everybody wants a peaceful solution to what is going on there, and you want long-lasting peace and not just something that keeps things under boil. Is it possible to eradicate this ideology? I mean, it's a bit like what you're telling me about radical Islam or Islam in general, which is why you're an ex-Muslim, because you're just like, you've given up on this. It's like there's no hope there. And Hamas ideology and this kind of extremist ideology, can you actually completely eradicate this?
So when we talk about the Hamas ideology, like if you look at their manifesto, they're quoting the hadith. When they talk about Muslims will kill all the Jews until the rocks and the trees will call out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come kill him." That's a Sahih hadith. So if you're a Sunni Muslim, which is about 90% of Muslims, you believe that to be true. That is a prophecy. That is this is part of your religion. And so the only way, the sad truth is it's really like a hydra. It's like that mythical hydra, the snake, that when you cut off its head, two more are going to grow in its place. Hamas is just one head of this snake. Even if you chop it off, who cares? Nothing happened. Where is the funding for Hamas coming from? It's coming from Iran. all they're going to do is pass it. Okay, fine, we'll pay Hezbollah now. You know what I mean? Like, or what happened when we eradicated Al-Qaeda? ISIS grew. You know, you can't eradicate an idea. This will continue to morph. It will continue to grow. As long as people are still believing this doctrine to be the word of Allah and to be something, you know, immutable. When we start to empower and support reform-minded Muslims and their voices and their work, then maybe they can start to become the dominant voices. They can start to become the mainstream Muslims. But right now, the money coming from Iran and the money coming from Qatar and the, you know, all of these Islamist organizations that are paying for Ilhan Omar's campaign and Kamala Harris's campaign and, you know, Rashida Tlaib's campaign, we're up against that. You know, like who do the progressive Muslims have to support them? You know, they have petrodollars behind them. What do we have? You know, we have a few hashtags, we have our voices every now and then. And this is what you're talking about with the Palestinians, with the Gazans against Hamas. It's the exact same thing. Why don't you hear the voices of all the Gazans that hate Hamas and that don't want anything to do with Hamas? Well, because they're not the ones with power. They're not the ones with money. They're not the ones with influence. They're not the ones with guns. And so this is just where, this is what it is. It's David versus Goliath right now. And if the progressive-minded Muslims can get the support of the West versus the way the West is supporting the actual fundamentalists, the conservatives, the extremists, if they started putting their time and energy and effort and money behind supporting liberal-minded Muslims, then we might have a chance, because it has to come from within. It's not going to come externally. Then maybe they'll start to become the mainstream voice. Who knows? I won't be alive to see it, but I hope it happens.
Final question for you. What do you think is the future for Gaza? Do you think a two-state solution is possible? What'll be the future of the Palestinian people by the end of this?
I mean, that's a really great question. I personally do not think that history will repeat itself. I do not think that this teeny tiny country of Israel that will ever allow itself again to be in this position. So before October 7th, there was like tens of thousands of people from Gaza were coming into Israel every day to work their 9 to 5 and then crossing the border and going back home to Gaza again. That's never going to happen. That's never going to happen again. You know, there's not going to be, I mean, I don't even know if there's going to even be a Gaza, to be perfectly honest. I can't even imagine them allowing the risk of this to happen again. But who knows? I might be surprised. I don't know, but I can't imagine, you know, I think it's really too soon to even ask that question. It's like if it was immediately after World War II, would we ask Jewish people if they want to be neighbors, you know, with Germany? That's it.
Yeah.
You know, how can you even ask that question right now? So, of course, it's not all Palestinians. Of course, it's not all Gazans, but it's a risk, you know, and if they are not only looking after protecting their citizens, but like I said, protecting the actual Jewish people that are left on the planet, 0.2%, is that they're already such a tiny minority.
Yeah.
And they want to have one tiny sliver of the planet where they can live in peace and comfortably, then they're going to make sure that the people that are living there are completely protected. So I don't know. And this is why in that tablet article that I wrote right after this happened, my feeling was, this is it. We're done. There's never this two-state solution that we tried, for over 70 years for it to happen, was constantly being rejected because the other side simply did not want an Israel to exist. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They do not want to see, the whole thing needs to be Palestine. And so it was an all or nothing attitude. And unfortunately, it looks like now it's nothing.
Well, on that very grim note, Yasmine, it's been a real honor to have you speak to us, and I gained so much knowledge from you, and I'm sure as of our viewers and our listeners, and I really wish you all the best in your ongoing fight against radical Islam and all of those other unsavory things in the world.
Thank you so much. And all the power to you as well. I'm also a huge fan, and I love how incredibly fierce you are. As they say, the divine in me sees the divine in you. So, you are my soul sister with that
Oh,
same fierce attitude.
that
And I
you have no
absolutely love
idea.
it.
Yeah, you have no idea how much that means to me, and I hope that one day we actually get a chance to meet each other in person, and maybe we could have, yeah, and I'm sure we'd have a ball. So, um, but thank you so much for making the time, Yasmine. I know you're so busy, and I really hope to look forward to reading more of your stuff and your commentary, and you'll always have my support.
Thank you so much. Lovely. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.